So I've been getting some angry messages over the last week or so from people who are quite upset about the fact that I've been exceptionally quiet, especially since the recent statements and actions taken by the US government with regard to South Africa. Some quite over-the-top remarks, but also some more serious concerns, people asking why have I disappeared and so forth. Now, it was not quite my choice to be as quiet as I was, but there were some very important developments also in my personal life and professional life, which I might share some of later. But let me use this opportunity to make a few remarks about what happened over the past few weeks, and also to assure you that I am back and that you will be hearing more from me, not just about issues relating to South Africa, the West, Western civilization, our culture, tradition, and so forth, but also, at least in the near future, especially about the developments with the United States government taking such a strong stance with regard to South Africa and the response from the South African government and people within South Africa. So I'm not going to go through everything that has happened over the last few weeks. I'm pretty sure you already have a very good idea of many of the public stances taken by President Donald Trump, the Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and many other politicians, business leaders, journalists, and so forth in America with regard to South Africa. Now, within South Africa, there has been quite a backlash from obviously the South African government. And as always, and as could have been predicted, some people in the mainstream media, some academics, and some commentators and analysts who have rushed to the defense of the South African government, seemingly believing that if the South African government is criticized, or if South Africa as a state is criticized, then that implies that every person living within the territory of South Africa is being attacked or criticized. When what's happening in South Africa is that every person living in this country is being disadvantaged by the destructive behavior of the ANC government, a government that should be called to order. And when this government is called to order, it's not the people who are called to order. It is the leaders of the country that are called to order, and they ought to be called to order. The ANC government in South Africa has become increasingly radicalized over the last few years. On this channel in the past, we've spoken a lot about the National Democratic Revolution, which is essentially the strategy followed by the ruling party, the ANC, according to which they seek to use democracy to promote socialism or socialist goals. And so a few years ago, the ANC has declared at one of their conferences that they are now ready for the second phase of the revolution. The first phase was to get control of the levers of power through multi-party democracy, which they believe is the most efficient way of promoting socialism. And then the second phase is using that power, in other words, using the state to implement increasingly radical and leftist policy ideas. And so over the last few years, we've had this aggressive push, firstly to change the South African constitution, especially the property rights clause, to empower the state to confiscate private property without compensation. But we've had other radical measures as well, such as attempts to nationalize healthcare in South Africa, claiming that because nationalized healthcare works in Sweden and England, it will work in South Africa. And also the very destructive Bela Act, a piece of legislation according to which the government seeks to take control of especially Afrikaner schools that are generally well-functioning schools by taking control of the decision-making authority that school governing bodies have over language policies and admission policies. And then more recently, the announcement of a 100 billion rand blacks-only fund created by the South African government. And of course, the money will come from the private sector through taxation. And the idea of this fund is to allocate this money to black entrepreneurs on a racial basis. These are just a few examples of destructive policy ideas. But other than that, on the international arena, the South African government has become much more active and aggressive over the last few years. For example, charging the Israeli government with genocide at the International Court of Justice, claiming that they are doing this because they have a moral duty to act and because they are acting consistently upon their moral convictions. The South African government is also among the governments in the world that most consistently votes against the United States at the United Nations. The South African government seeks to play a very active role, something of a kingmaker role, you might even say, in the BRICS alliance. And the South African government also serves in some fundamental ways as a springboard to the Chinese government to have more control over the African continent. So it was inevitable for the United States to take a stance against what is happening in South Africa. In fact, it's surprising that it only happened now. It should have happened years ago. But what is also remarkable is that when President Donald Trump, during his previous term, before Joe Biden became president, took a stance against what is happening in South Africa in 2018, he was severely criticized within South Africa, but also within the US. Speaking to friends in the United States about this, mentioning the Trump tweet about South Africa, they still remember the backlash that he had gotten. Why? Because for decades South Africa was hailed as a miracle story, as the poster child of the United Nations and you might even say globalist forces. South Africa was hailed and held up as an example of how a government and a country ought to be structured to ensure peace, stability and prosperity. And so in speaking out against the South African government, Trump effectively is also speaking out against the mainstream global narrative. Now, he knew that this would lead to pushback because this has already happened in 2018. Yet, despite this knowledge, he took a much firmer stance now in the year 2025, which is significant because it says a lot about the resolve of the American president, but it also says a lot about the changing times that we are in. It is becoming increasingly difficult to hold South Africa up as an example that the world ought to follow, because in South Africa there is virtually not a single government function, with the exception of taxation, of course, that is still functioning as it ought to be. South African society is collapsing on virtually every sphere, whether we're talking about the economy, education, safety and security, crime, government service delivery, water and electricity. You can go down the list. There's not a single example of the functions that a government ought to fulfill that is functioning properly in South Africa or that is increasing. Virtually everything is worsening, once again, with the exception of tax collection. Now, let me make a quick remark about the executive order and the statement by the US government. This is something that should be welcomed because the ANC government in South Africa have said over and over again that they are guided by the balance of forces. In other words, in their pursuit of turning South Africa into a socialist or a communist society, they always consider the extent to which there is a pushback. If there is not pushback, they move more aggressively. If there is strong pushback, they reconsider their positions. And so what we are witnessing at the moment is the strongest and most significant pushback there has been against the South African government since they took power more than 30 years ago. And so, of course, this would lead to outcries and screams of international interference and so forth. But I should also mention that in this executive order, particular mention was made of the Afrikaner people. Now, as an Afrikaner, I can surely say that we are very grateful for the fact that this is done. This is also a historic moment because for more than 30 years, the Afrikaner people have almost exclusively been bashed and attacked and vilified. If you attack or vilify the Afrikaner people, you have a blank check. You can say whatever you want. But if you take a stance for the rights of the Afrikaner people, you are attacked by the mainstream for being racist, bigoted, or whatever. And so the fact that the US government was not only prepared to criticize the South African government, but for the first time in more than 30 years, actively take a stance for the legitimate right and pursuit of the Afrikaner people to also have a sense of freedom is remarkable. This executive order also speaks about refugee status for Afrikaner people, which I have to say has led to some heated debates within the Afrikaner community. A lot of people have already left South Africa since 1994, especially white South Africans and English-speaking white South Africans more so than the Afrikaner community. A lot of people want to leave the country but aren't able to do so, and consequentially has welcomed this statement. But I have to add, a lot of people, and I would say the vast majority of the Afrikaner people, want to stay in South Africa. We want to stay in South Africa because this is our home. We want to stay in South Africa because this is where we became a people. We are not Dutch, we are not Germans, we are not French, we are not British. We do have European ancestors, but we became a people with a unique language and a unique culture on African soil. And we firmly believe that if you take a cultural community off its land, the culture dies. And so we want to ensure that there is a future for our community. We want to ensure that there is a future for our culture. We are inspired by the words of N.P. van Wyk Louw, one of the great Afrikaans philosophers, who said that it is our duty to carry the treasure that we have inherited from our ancestors safely through the crowd. And that is what we intend to do. So if there is an opportunity to leave South Africa, some people will take that up, and they obviously have the right to do so. But a lot of people would want to stay and build a future here in this country, despite the adverse circumstances. And so I think one of the most clear messages having come out of South Africa over the last week was that of Joost Strydom of Oranje, who said, "We welcome assistance from the United States, but the most important assistance we can get is to help us here. Help us here in the southern tip of Africa, where we can ensure a future for our community. Yes, if qualified people leave South Africa to go to America, it would be in America's interest. But it would also be in America's interest to have a healthy, well-functioning and free Afrikaner community in the southern tip of Africa. But that does not just go for the Afrikaner community. It goes for other cultural or minority communities who live in South Africa, who are fed up with the South African government, who are fed up with the fact that we live in a country with the most race laws in history, who are fed up with government corruption, blatant and grotesque government corruption, fed up with the fact that government leaders are not prosecuted even though everyone knows who they are, who the people are who have stolen the money, who are fed up with the fact that government service delivery is failing spectacularly, and who are fed up with the fact that minorities in South Africa, but especially the white minority and especially the Afrikaner minority, are used as a scapegoat, still blamed for everything that is wrong in South Africa, for every single one of the government's failures, and also used as a punching bag. A punching bag in the sense that politicians attack this minority community on public platforms, even chanting about murdering and slaughtering them as a way of being populist and gaining political support. Yet despite all of these factors, we want to remain in South Africa, and we want to have a future here in the southern tip of Africa. And we will remain in South Africa. Some of us will leave, but the majority will stay. We will remain here and we will continue to build a future for our children. And we would very much like to work with anyone outside of South Africa who is interested in cooperating or playing some form of supportive role. Having said that, we are very grateful for the stance that has been taken by the US government, taking the South African government to task for their atrocious behavior over the last few decades and especially the last few years. Something that should have happened long ago, and I'm sure something that will happen increasingly.